Life has evolved lots of ways to hurt other forms of life. In this video, I'll talk about 4 animals from a planet called Origin that have evolved complex offensive mechanisms allowing for ranged combat. The first feature uses its voice to hunt prey and attack rivals. They evolved to produce high-power sound waves by vibrating their vocal cords at sonic speeds. Its throat and the inside of its mouth has ossified over millions of years, allowing it to reflect the sound it produces rather than absorb it and possibly damage itself. These bones are some of the smoothest in the animal kingdom and are visibly reflective. Of course, you wouldn't notice something like that while the animal is alive, because it weighs 500 kilograms and is very aggressive. Their sonic attacks can cripple most living things, and often this animal will meet its end by the same attacks from a rival or even itself if its setup fails. They are obviously a heck of a lot bigger than any other living rodent, so how'd that happen? Luckily for us, they evolved in one of the best known places in the Orient, so fossil evidence tells the story of a little mouse that became king of the Oriental Plains. Only 20 million years ago, the mouse was a tiny carnivore that fed on even smaller arthropods. At the same time, a strange group of giant arthropods settled there, and overhunted the larger animals so there were no more megafauna left in the area. Soon, these sapient arachnids continued to develop their society and their learning and were more careful with the environment. Large herbivores moved in, but dangerous carnivores were still kept away. The little mouse took advantage of the plentiful meat, usually by scavenging the dead, but as they were allowed to grow bigger, some evolved to actually hunt. Eventually, the arachnids were outcompeted by humanoids and went extinct. Their land was barren, and the somewhat large mouse rat took to the waters. It grew much larger, and eventually the big rat we know today came back out to hunt the returning wildlife. It has an aquatic relative that's also pretty large, but not quite the 3-meter giant that is the Mantis Rat. It's a 3-meter long carnivorous rodent with fearsome front teeth and a bipedal posture reminiscent of something like a king dragon. Their short arms are probably vestigial as they don't use them for much. A common question concerning the Mantis Rat is, how could it possibly have evolved something like this? How did the ossified throat evolve without the sonic voice box, or vice versa? Well, the answer is most likely that they evolved together. Not only does the ossification protect the murder mouse from its own attacks, but it also strengthens the attack at the same time by concentrating the sound waves. So they probably evolved in tandem, meaning they got stronger side by side. The mantis rat is an important apex predator in the Orient as it controls the population of an extremely hardy and versatile carnivore called a coyote. That animal deserves its own section in a different video, but it is one of the most widespread animals on Origin thanks to its adaptability in urban environments. The lichen volcano is home to many strange reptiles, but the most recognizable might be a squamate that can shoot fire from its arm. If all squamates are technically lizards, then this one is too. However, it diverged from most other squamates in the early Jurassic, before mosasaurs or even true snakes. So it's kinda up in the air whether you want to call it a lizard or not, but most people do. They have a very noticeable dimorphism, with the brightly colored males also having a complex chemical weapon on one of their arms, while the larger females have muted colors and no visible arm cannon. However, the females do have chemical weaponry, it's just simpler as it only requires one ingredient. Let's talk about that. They have unique sweat-like glands in their arms and hands that release sulfuric acid. This can be pressurized to shoot relatively far. They get the sulfur in their diet from both plants and animals, as it's somewhat common where they live, as blue sulfur fires are common on the lichen volcano. The males, however, have a more complicated attack style. The sulfur in their diet combines with carbon from plants and potassium nitrate to produce a dry substance very similar to gunpowder. This only happens in the male's dominant arm, while the other is left to be a relatively normal reptilian arm. During their version of puberty, the male's arm is transformed into a chamber where this gunpowder is made and dried. It's then ignited using a burst of heat, as this animal is partially warm-blooded. The scientific word for an animal like this that can regulate its heat variably is an endothermic poikilotherm, or just a mesotherm. While this form of attack is very frightening and sudden, the reptile can only use it once every few days, and is thus very careful with it, only attacking when cornered or against males of the same species. This is the Timberzard, also known as Pyrosaurus rex. Including the tail, it can have a length surpassing 2 meters, and standing up straight, it might be able to look at a human eye to eye. They weigh around 100 kilograms in adulthood, though males tend to be slightly less and females slightly more. While the males are the ones with the characteristic bright colors and arm cannon, it's also hard to confuse the females for any other animal. The females are also much more liberal with their use of chemical weaponry, spraying at anything vaguely threatening. While it's not totally understood how or why something like this evolved, scientists have some pretty good guesses. It probably started off more similarly to the female's method of sulfuric acid spraying, though why this happens through the hands as opposed to the mouth is difficult to say. Reptiles don't have sweat glands at all, so how they evolved these mechanisms is still a mystery. The sulfuric acid attack works pretty well for self-defense or even hunting, so why did the complicated arm cannon evolve, and why was it just in males? The arm cannon is a very costly weapon, which is why it's used so sparingly. The right colors and elaborate head ornaments are also pretty costly, which leads us to one likely conclusion. It's a bit of a cop-out, but whenever animals develop something costly for seemingly little to no reason, we tend to guess it's for sexual selection. This is a pretty good guess though, as it's a sign the male is healthy and can sire strong offspring. Usually. The Timberzard is an important icon in lichen culture, and to be clear, these lichens that are alive today are only distantly related to the ones that lived in the Orient. They diverged 20 million years ago, and the ones that live on the Occidental lichen volcano are the only lichens alive today despite their worldwide distribution for most of the Neogene. On the muddy shores of Eidolon, one can find a rare amphibian with a strange head. It's a lepospondal nectrid amphibian that is closely related to another animal called Diplocaulus, which has two protrusions coming from its skull. And this animal has a more derived form of these protrusions that allows it to sling rocks it collects in two pouches on the sides of its torso. It has a band of skin on the ends of its protrusions that can stretch and is used as the shooting off point for the rocks. It is able to manipulate the rocks and the sling using its prehensile tail with three finger-like appendages. It's very selective about the roundness and density of the rocks that it chooses. It's a very rare animal, as are most of amphibians on origin. The water pollution and air pollution affects them strongly because their skin is thin and permeable. 30 million years ago, this nectrid had a full membrane across its long horns. These were used for thermoregulation and or display. After this, the evolutionary path is a bit muddy, but we can see that the membrane slowly moved up the horns till it was one relatively thin band. At the same time, its tail became more dexterous, and most likely it grew the characteristic pouches on the sides of its torso around this time. While it's difficult to find direct evidence of a pouch like this, we can see that it most likely had one because there were often rocks preserved around the torso. This is the Bowhorn. From the tip of the nose to the end of the tail, these animals maxed out at 1.5 meters. Without the rocks, they weighed about 40 kilograms. Depending on how many rocks they had, those could have added a significant amount of weight to the animal. The membrane is kept moist at all times to increase friction and improve grip. Because of that, like other amphibians, the Bowhorn depends a lot on water for its survival. So, because of the factors I mentioned before with pollution, this animal is critically endangered. Okay, so why did the Bowhorn evolve this slingshot in the first place? Most likely, it came under fire as all amphibians have, and needed to find a new niche. What ended up working for the Bowhorn was for its membrane to slowly turn into a slingshot. This way, it can deal surprising amounts of damage to animals, plants, and objects that it otherwise wouldn't be able to reach. And you might be wondering, what advantages took the Bowhorn from a full membrane to the thin band we see today? While there's no clear answer, we can, as usual, give some guesses. The best guess is that even one hole at the base of the membrane serves to loosen it enough to better deflect debris and improve aerodynamics, or hydrodynamics. The bigger the hole at the bottom, the more elastic the remaining membrane becomes. While the Bowhorn is a very unique animal, it's not very well known. This is due to its rarity and of course its habitat in the hated Eidolon Island. In the Orient, which at this point if you watch my older videos you're probably starting to think that the Orient on origin is a very dangerous place, which is true. Another horrifically dangerous life form in the Orient is one of the few that actively hunts humanoids. It lives far away from El Mosco in the relatively flat plains. It evolved convergently with a horsefly, but it's not closely related and doesn't have a larval form. The Mantipper has a much more efficient form of chemical weaponry than even the male Timberzard. It uses and collects gunpowder in a similar way. However, it also collects small bullet-like pebbles with which it is very particular that it inserts into something like a reservoir in the center of its chest. This reservoir can be opened using specialized muscles in its chest. It then ignites the gunpowder in a similar way as the Timberzard, but it uses much less and is capable of controlling it to a much higher degree. This way, it can shoot several bullets before it runs out of gunpowder. It's semi-intelligent and it communicates with its partners to hunt with the highest possible efficiency. They also have a scythe at the end of their arm cannons, with which they strike their opponents at close range. These insects are very careful though and prefer to fight at long distance. They can run at speeds upwards of 70 kilometers an hour thanks to their light build and mostly hollow exoskeleton. This is the Mantipper. The name is derived from a practice done by Anthroposian teenagers in which they tip cows over using magic spells. The Mantipper is named such because it tips people over with something that at the time of its naming was considered to be magic. The Mantipper stands at 2 meters tall, though it rarely weighs more than 100 kilograms. The Mantipper synthesizes gunpowder similar to the male Timberzard. It has plenty of sulfur and potassium nitrate in its diet, though it makes charcoal itself. How this started is still a mystery, but every Mantipper mother burns wood for its child using one of its bullets. The child then collects the charcoal to make gunpowder, and can use the same method as its mother used to collect charcoal after that. Adults collect charcoal once a week like clockwork. The hole at the end of its hand, along with many of the other conspicuous holes on the Mantipper's body, are derived from spiracles, which are holes that most insects use for respiration. The scythe-like finger is similar to the praying mantis, to which it is closely related. The reservoir in the middle of its chest is also derived from a spiracle, though it uses it more similarly to a marsupial pouch. Because this cartridge is also connected to what was the respiratory system, the bullets from the reservoir can go directly to the hands without direct manipulation on the Mantipper's part. As any entomologist on Origin worth their salt would know, giant arthropods like this have lungs in their abdomen along with a complex respiratory system, and thus don't need to depend so much on their spiracles. Okay, so why the heck did this evolve? You might be guessing what I'm about to say after this. It's difficult to say. However, there's a fringe guess that is, at the very least, fun to talk about. Before I can talk about that though, I have to talk about an organism called the witch. The witch is a fascinating animal that has a very distinct kind of magic, a magic that affects DNA. While it's unlikely that the witch was solely responsible for every derived trait of the Mantipper, it likely aided in many of the things that make it such a horrifying creature. The witch has been known to affect animal evolution before. A specifically well-documented example is the evolution of the genus Dritolus. These humanoids diverged drastically in the very recent past due to what is likely the curses of a single witch. While it's most common for the witch's mutation causing magic to injure or outright kill its target, it is possible for the magic to spark an evolutionary advantageous mutation. So back to the Mantipper. While its spiracles may have been used to throw rocks, many of its derived features are likely caused by a witch. The Mantipper is very important in cultures around the Orient, though never in a positive light. It is most common in the country of Anthropos, though it can often appear in Lunix and everywhere in between. However, it avoids the dives like the plague. That's about it for this video. Check out my Patreon where you can subscribe for $1 a month to support me and get your name at the end of my videos. Thanks Captain Cobop, Art of Dying, and Mr. Kill. My next speculative evolution video will be on mechanical life. Hope to see you then, and thanks for watching! Sorry this one was late again. Hashtag blame Lena. No, I'm just kidding.